Hi, in this video I'm going to go over how to do a bound buttonhole. So a bound buttonhole is basically a tiny welt, double welt pocket, so it has welts on both sides and finished off on the inside by hand. Alright, so bound buttonholes are often added to the jacket before the lining and the facing are done, so you want to be able to access that area of the jacket, often after the lapel is pad stitched and everything is in there. I'm going to do this as if it is not a pad stitched or interfaced one. This one had interfacing and then I added canvas as a stabilizer. If you were doing a jacket where the jacket is interfaced with canvas, then you can definitely do that as ahead of time. All right, so the first thing you want to do is figure out where your buttonhole is going to go. So you're going to need your button, you're going to need a way of marking it, and you're going to need a ruler. So in general, the buttonhole goes about 5/8 down from the bottom of the roll line. I actually prefer it at the roll line. I just feel that 5/8 down from the roll line, which is what was done on here, is just a little bit too far down. And so I don't like it quite that low. I don't mind how far in it is, but I do like it a bit higher. I like it right around the roll line. So, but usually, typically 5/8 below the roll line, and then it is placed in position so that it is going to be the width of the button in, which in my case is about 5/8. So I'm going to go 5/8 in and mark a dot vertically, and then I'm going to do it at my roll line. So that's going to be just directly across, and so that's going to be my first mark. Then the width of the buttonhole is the width of your button. And if your button fits in here, it actually measures it for you, but mine's too thick. Or I can use this gauge. So the top of the gauge has the slider and it will measure the width of my button. So mine's just under 5/8, and then a scant 1/4 inch, which will bring my button width to 3/4. So I'm just going to place this on here and measure over 3/4. And then I just want to make sure that this is a horizontal line directly across from my original point. Okay, then I'm going to pin mark this. So to pin mark, you will take your pins and insert them through the fabric, and the point of this is so that I can mark it on the other side. So I'm not doing this with my facing, so I'm just going to pull my facing away, and then I want to be able to mark it between those two pins. And then this will give me an idea of where to put my stabilizer. Buttonhole area is always stabilized with a lightweight iron-on interfacing. It just provides support because you will be cutting a hole into a bound button, just like you do with a regular machine sewn button or a hand sewn button. And then you will be turning it to the right side or the inside, so you just want something that will stabilize it. So now that I've marked this, I'm also gonna just mark it there and there, just take my pins out. Okay, now I want to put in my iron-on stabilizer. So I just have a piece that will fit in between my dart and my my lapel. So this is a iron-off pen, so I'm going to now thread trace this so I don't lose my mark. Okay. So I'm just going to come up through my mark here. So marking it on the back was so that I could just center that interfacing in place. And this will baste the interfacing on and mark it at the same time. And then I'll take this to the iron and fuse on that interfacing. Okay, so I'm just at the ironing board and I have my interfacing in place. So I'm just going to fold this up so I don't get any glue on it. I'm going to put some moisture on it, like I always do. And then I have my iron set at a 2. And I'm going to use a little steam, and then I'll be counting for 15 seconds just to make sure that it's fused on really well. Firm pressure, no wiggling. All right. And then that is in place. So on the wrong side, on that interfacing piece, I want to mark my line again. So I'm just going to mark that across here, so you can see it a little better. Okay, and then I'm just going to draw my vertical lines up. Now I want this buttonhole to be approximately 1/8 of an inch tall, above and below that center line where it opens. So I want to measure that here. So I find that if I do 1/8, the rolling of the fabric creates that extra little bit. So I'm just going to do 1/8 above and 1/8 below. Oops, that looks a little wide. So just try to make sure that they're even, because this is going to be your stitching lines. And you're going to make sure that that's straight up and down on both sides. Okay, so that it looks evenly marked on both sides like this. That is your buttonhole height that is marked. So we have our buttonhole placement point, that was that first dot that we marked. Then we had our buttonhole width, so that was the measurement of the buttonhole plus a scant 1/4 inch. And then we have our buttonhole height, so that's how wide this piping is going to be. So remember, if you want to have 1/8 of an inch lips, you have to measure a little bit less, because otherwise the fabric, when it rolls, especially on a bulky thick fabric, it takes up space and then they get bigger. Okay, so now that we've put on our interfacing, we've marked it on the wrong side, both the height and the width and the placement. So we're going to take our piping. So our piping is cut on the bias, so it has a bit of stretch to it. And you do want to give it a little bit of a stretch, because we want to get rid of, so this just helps it maintain its shape when it's sewn in place. And then we're going to put some interfacing on this. So I've cut this 2 inches by 3 inches, which is, the 2 inches is pretty typical for the height, and then the width is usually 2 inches wider than your finished buttonhole. So my buttonhole's just under 1 inch, so I was cautious and did 3 inches. So I'm gonna iron this on, and then we will position it in place. So just at the ironing board, a little bit of moisture, and 15 seconds. Take this over and put it on the jacket. Okay, so this is going to go on to the right side of the jacket, right sides together. So just to find an easier way of getting this on, I just fold it in half, center it over my line there, and then open it up. And I'm just going to pin that down for a second, and I'll baste it in place. Okay, so I'm just going to baste across here. I'm just basting around the perimeter just so I can temporarily hold it. Doesn't have to be very strong because you're immediately going to take it out. Okay, so let's baste it on so that we can now sew around this box from this side. I want to sew this with very small, like 1 mil or 1.5 mil stitch length all the way around. I'm not going to backstitch. I'm just going to start on the long edge, go up and around and down and back, and I'm going to overlap almost the entire length of the box. So I'm going to place this into the machine. go a little narrower than I went last time. See if I can get this piping very narrow. So I just have the setup so it's just under an 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to sew right across. Stopped right on my line there. And sew up. And try to stop with your needle down. And then again, just under 1/8 of an inch wide. And you want to pivot on every one of these corners. You don't want to lift your needle. And so see how my thread is just coming out right there. So I'll be stopping just a little bit before that stitch. And then I'll sew all the way across again. Okay, so I'm going to take that out. And then there you go. So it's not bad. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. Okay, so then the next step is to cut that. You want to cut down the center of this. You don't want to cut the garment at this time, just your piping. Stop a 1/4 inch from the end and cut towards the prong or towards the corners, forming prongs. Again, try not to cut your garment fabric at this time. And then you want to flip it over and cut the garment fabric from the other side. So you do need to take caution to make sure you get all the way to the corners. And we flip it over and do it from this side. So I'm going to take out that center basting and I'm going to trim down my threads. And sometimes it does take some effort to get everything. So stopping exactly at that corner. Without cutting your threads. Right. And you're going to take out your basting. Pull this through to the other side. So you just take it and push it through. Pull it through like this. And just give it a gentle little pull here and here, there, there. And then we'll take this over to the iron. Okay, so I'm going to iron this up with the seam allowance so that it's all up on the bottom edge. Forming a crease. And then you're going to be folding it back down, filling in half of that opening with the piping. So it should fill up half. So in this case, I've accidentally filled in more than half. So and part of that is because I didn't trim down my seam allowance. So this seam allowance is a bit thick. So I'm just going to trim it down a little bit. And that will help me so that when I go to fold this down, it's not quite as bulky there. Okay, and that's the goal, is to get this to be nice and crisp and straight across there. Okay, so once you have trimmed off that seam allowance and you've just checked to make sure that it is trimmed enough to get the right height for your piping to take up half of that opening, you'll repeat that on the other side. So I'm going to make my crease here. Or actually, I'm going to repeat it on the other side first. So I'm going to bring this around and I'm going to press this up, seam allowance included, towards the other side. Forming a crease, and then I'm going to trim down that seam allowance so it doesn't interfere with the size of my piping. And then refold it so that the two of them form close up the opening right down the center. And if you have a fabric that creases well, it's helpful. And then check on the right side to see. So my piping is not quite even. My bottom one is a little bit higher on this side. So I'm going to pull it down and then recrease it. Now just make sure that your triangles are like these little triangles are out of the way when you do this. And be careful if your fabric is heat sensitive, like use a press cloth, which I know is more difficult when you're trying to see what you're doing. But you do want to do your best to make sure that that is looking as good as you can with the iron helping you out. So just pulling this in a little bit because my triangles are not quite forming a nice square edge. Okay, when you're happy with the distribution of your piping, baste your piping together. So just taking my lips and I'm basting them together. Just make sure that they're evenly distributed. All right, so once that is, your lips are basted together, that'll stay in until you're completely done. We are now going to stitch the ditch above and below that. You do not have to go in a full rectangle around because you're going to be sewing your triangles separately later. Okay, so you're going to place your buttonhole into the machine. Just make sure that your piping is not folded awkwardly underneath. You want to stitch this in the ditch, which for me it's very difficult because I'm using the dark thread and a very light colored piping, and so it's really going to show, but it won't show so much if you match your thread colors. I'm using a very small stitch length, 1 millimeter, and so I'm recommending that you lock stitch this in place, so no length for 3 stitches, and then increase to your 1 millimeter. And essentially you want this to be right where the two meet. And then go back to your lock stitch. Okay, and I'm going to rotate this and do the other side. I found that my piping was pulling a little bit, so I just pulled that pin there just to hold it. You could baste it as well. And back to your 1 millimeter. So you can see that I did get a little further away, but again, if that was matching colored thread, it wouldn't be so bad. You wouldn't even see it. And I did pull my facing out of the way so it didn't get caught. So, and then you can cut your threads. And then we'll stitch the triangles. Okay, so to stitch your triangles, you're going to fold from the right side up, you're going to fold back the fabric, and I like to just make sure that I get the base of that triangle really well on both sides. So it actually helps out if you sew this in a small arc all the way around, so, or not around, across. So I'm gonna angle in from over here and come up and go onto my point, onto my corner of my base of my triangle, and then down on the base of the triangle. So it's gonna make a small arc here, and then I'll zigzag stitch over this. I want to make sure I get over these stitches, otherwise they will show. So again, very small stitches. All right, I'm off, and so now I can go backwards over my triangle and secure it. And because I was pulling just so ever so slightly as I went back and forth, I created a back and forth zigzag pattern with a small arc here. And then let's check it. So if you do the arc instead of straight across, you shouldn't have puckering here, and it should catch nicely. And then you can press it and it should look good. And then we'll turn it around and do the other side. Again, I'm actually pulling firmly, but also flattening out that triangle. And again, I want to sew over those stitches from the box when I sewed around my buttonhole opening. So I'm not quite going over my stitches, so I'm going to back stitch a little bit and angle it a bit more. See how that looks. So, and then it looks like kind of like almost a heartbeat monitor on this side. All right. So now it looks like I have creased it or got puckers in it, but because I went at an angle, when I press that, they'll be fine. Okay, so the next step is to just make sure that you've trimmed all your threads, and you're going to trim around your piping, rounding your corners off. So, since my buttonhole is not nearly as long as I need it, or as the piping, I'm going to cut quite a bit off. And on the facing side, you actually may have to make sure that it's shorter than where it folds in. You don't want that interfering with your closing of your facing, so that needs to be at least that short. You can even use pinking shears. Just make sure you don't cut any of your garment fabric. So after you have secured your piping in place, you might want to put a bit of canvas on it. So this goes underneath the piping here and deters this from showing when the garment is pressed. So it needs to go in between here and here. So to do that, I'm going to center this over my piping, and this way. Yeah, this way is a little bit better. So I'm going to just fold that in half just like I did my piping. I'm going to place it here with a couple of pins. And then I want to pin mark, or I'm going to baste it in place, and then I'm going to pin mark it just like I did to mark my buttonhole placement. So again, this isn't going to be on very long, so you don't have to do this very securely. It just needs to be enough to keep it in place so you can mark your placement. Then from the right side, I've basted that in. I'm going to pin mark right here, right on the edge there, right on the edge there. Okay, and I'm going to just mark in between my pins. Okay. I can take those pins out, and then I need to cut a line, a slash through here. I'll be eventually making a little window to pull my piping through. So be very careful not to cut your piping. So 1/8 of an inch in is as big as I want to go with this. Cut off 1/8 there, and do the same thing on the other side. Okay. So just do it in very small amounts at a time. I'm just looking for where I stitched those triangles. I'm looking for that stitch across, stitch across. Try to be very exact with this. Okay. And we're going to carefully pull this through our opening here. And so that just creates a little bit of a barrier or a shield. So if you have canvas on already, like as part of your jacket, you would cut through there and pull it through the canvas just like that. Okay. So you're going to cross stitch all around your piping to the canvas, and then your canvas would be cross stitched to your dart as well. And these stitches should not go through to the right side of the garment. They're permanent. So into my canvas from right to left, then into my piping from right to left. A centimeter apart. So if I had left my basting in, it would have helped a little bit because then these corners wouldn't be flipping up. So they're a little further spaced on the canvas side and closer together on the piping side, just to get around those curves. So I'm running out of thread, so I'm just going to knot this off and rethread. Okay, so I'm just continuing around, doing my cross stitch, attaching these two together. Again, do not go through to your garment outside fabric. Get back to where you started, just make a knot. Okay, so then you're going to trim all around your canvas, leaving a little bit around, so you don't want to, if this is only if you're adding your canvas, if your canvas is part of the front, you would not be trimming this. Only if you've added canvas to help with the pressing of the garment. Okay, so once that's done, then you will stitch any parts that overlap your dart so that they are anchored to the dart itself. And these cross stitches allow it to help add stability, but you're not doing them tight. You want to do them loose so that it doesn't create puckers and pulls in the jacket when you're wearing it. And then knot that off. And then you can take that to the iron and press it now. Again, if your fabric is delicate, use something soft underneath, like a towel, to help cushion that a little bit, and a press cloth. Okay, got the ironing board, just iron it a little bit, give it a little steam. And then your roll line. And so, okay, so then we are going to pin mark again our facing to the buttonhole. So we'll baste it first, pin mark it, and then we will finish our backside. Okay, so we're going to base our facing around. We don't want it to move around a whole bunch while we are sewing this, so just make sure that it's a little bit more secure than your previous basting that was supposed to come out right away. Okay, and again, we're going to pin mark. Flipping it over and mark between your pins. I'm going to pin mark that just a little bit there and there. Okay. So there and there. And so this opening, I do not want very big. I don't want it a lot of this. I actually don't want to go past my box at all. I want to be inside that box. So we're going to cut a slash down this line. And then now some say don't do the triangles. Some say do the triangles. I find that the triangles do help a little bit, but they need to be like this does not, you don't want to cut this big at all. So I'm going to cut it, but you'll see how tiny my triangles are. And again, do not cut your piping. You only want to cut the facing. So I'm going to cut right down the piping, and I'm just going to go like only 1/8 of an inch wide. I'm not even like, even though each of my piping is 1/8 of an inch, I'm only going to go 1/8 of an inch for my triangle because I don't want a big amount of that underside to show. Okay, so there is my opening, and I do have 2 tiny little triangles. So you're not going to, so I'm going to make just a tiny little box around 1/8 of an inch on either side, and that's going to be my guideline for turning it in, but it's just a scant 1/8 of an inch. It's not like a full 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'm knotting my thread. I'm going to come in from the back side of that line that I just drew. I'm going to tuck my tail in so it doesn't get seen. Okay. And I'm going to fold this seam allowance in using my needle. Okay. And I'm going to slip stitch this right to my piping. And it's good if you could do small stitches, but if you can't, just go around a second time. I'm trying to do like a stitch right in that fold that I've created where I folded the seam allowance in. So I'm folding it right on that line, tucking it in, and then that's my stitching. So I don't want those stitches to show, so I want to slip stitch just over that line so no stitches are going to show. So slip stitches, a tiny stitch into the facing, a tiny stitch into the piping, a tiny stitch in the facing, and I go back and forth with small stitches. Okay, so a tiny stitch in my piping, and then a tiny stitch into my facing, right above where I came out of the piping. and directly below where I came out of the facing. So often also referred to as a ladder stitch because it looks like little rungs of a ladder. But after you've done a few, just tighten it up and it slips in nicely, forming a nice little line there. And just make sure you're always working on your line that you drew so that it stays square. And just pull that tight. Tuck in the next spot, so try not to pre-tuck it in. Like, I find that it just falls apart and frays if you do. So only tuck in what you're working on. Alright, so once you get all the way around, if you need to, you can go around again to make this, like, fill in any places that you feel like you missed. But otherwise, you just secure it with a couple of prick stitches, because otherwise they'll be seen. And then you'll cut that off. Right, so there is the right or the wrong side and the right side. So if I had done prick stitches, they would probably look a lot better because I could make it look like this. But I did the stitch in the ditch, but I wanted you to be able to see it. So again, if it was matching, it wouldn't be so unsightly. So we'll take this to the iron and press it. Okay, so give it one more press. In the front and the back. You can see the iron shine a little bit, so you can see that indentation from the piping. So that's exactly what would show on the right side if it wasn't for the canvas. So notice how where the canvas is, it looks great. So no iron shine anywhere. But yeah, so that's what it looks like, front and back. Okay, so that is your finished bound buttonhole. the next step would be to do the hem. So you would thread trace your hem so that we can do the bag lining.